As we continue our study in the book of Matthew, we now arrive at chapter 2. And as we segued between the first and second chapter, we got this simple but powerful example of Joseph as a man of faith, that as his life is changing and things are going a whole different direction than he would have ever thought even possible, he just has enough trust, enough faith to just take the next step, to just keep each day doing the next thing that God puts in front of him, not knowing where that's all going to end up. And so in the second chapter, Matthew begins to tell us now about the events surrounding the birth of Jesus. And he says that in the first verse, that there were Magi from the east that arrived in Jerusalem, and they asked Herod the king, "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we saw a star in the east, and we've come to worship him." Verse 3 says that when they asked this, Herod is very troubled, and in fact it says all of Jerusalem was troubled with him. Well, historically, Herod was so paranoid about his power being taken away or usurped from some future son that he had several wives and mistresses and all that sort of. So anytime a boy was born, he himself would kill his own sons, terrified that he'd somehow lose his power. Turns out, as history says, that he had a son named Archelaus who was hidden by a midwife and does grow up and does eventually take away his father's throne. But if you've got a king this paranoid, this frightened about holding on to his power, you want him happy. You don't want him upset. You want him to drink warm milk and soggy toast every night and sleep good. So when these folks show up and say, "We're here for the King of the Jews," you can imagine Herod saying, "This is me." They're like, no. They're the real king. What do you mean the real king? And it creates this very anxiety that Jerusalem doesn't want to see. And so Herod calls together the experts in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and they show him some scriptures about how it'd be in Bethlehem. And so he gets an idea of a village, but he certainly still doesn't know the address or which child it would be. So in verse 7, he secretly calls the Magi together and determined from them the exact time the star would appear. And then he tells them, "So go to Bethlehem and you find the child and let me know so that I can come worship too." Well, as you look over the chapter, you realize that Herod is not wanting to worship Jesus. He's wanting to destroy his competition. So it's not a genuine request. But he's interested in let me know so that I can come too. Well, the Magi leave Herod's presence and go on. Now, the word Magi is an unusual word. It's a Babylonian word, and it can be translated wise men or even maybe astronomers or something like that. But it has to do with men that would turn to natural science to try to find answers. For example, in those days, if some king's like, "Well, should I go into battle or should I not?" These are the kind of guys he might ask, "What do y'all think?" And depending on what nation we're talking about, they might cut a goat in two, and which way the kidney bounces, they could say, "Oh, well, that means this or that." And so they might use animals, or they might observe the weather. They certainly might observe the stars and try to learn from the natural environment some sort of answer. And so Herod's recognizing that they have wisdom from some other place, and he's trying to follow up or pursue that. But it also explains why some folks might have noticed a star and been interested in what that means. Well, in verse 9, after hearing the king, they went their way, and the star, which they had seen in the east, went on before them until it came and stood over where the child was. Which kind of brings up an interesting question. If the star is so reliable as a navigational aid that it doesn't just take them to Bethlehem, it takes them to the exact location, the exact house. So if the star is so accurate in its leading, it kind of makes us ask, well, why did they stop and ask Herod for directions in the first place? Well, maybe there's a hint here, because in verse 10 it says, "When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy." They're really excited, which kind of seems odd. I mean, haven't they been following this star for a while? So why are they so fired up? Well, perhaps it certainly suggests that maybe when they got to Jerusalem, which means they're within about 12 miles or so, that maybe the star dimmed, or maybe there were clouds in the sky that night, or maybe it's the daytime and they just don't want to wait till night to follow the star. But it does show us how this little subtlety in the text allows God, or God uses, to engage Herod in the process. Because if the wise men had gone directly to Jesus, Herod didn't know, you wouldn't have this rest of this chapter and the tragedy and the struggle that's going to result from that. So why does God do that? Well, it's a longer conversation, but it certainly suggests that where there is leadership, there is great responsibility, because Herod should have, as king of the Jews, led people to Jesus. His example would be to bring them to him. Instead, he rejects Jesus, in fact, tries to destroy him. But when we get to verse 11, we get an amazing example or picture of worship. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. They opened their treasures. They presented gold and frankincense and myrrh. Kind of unusual gifts. If you were to imagine this was almost like a baby shower, imagine that someone gives a gift of gold. Well, I mean, that's great, but wow, that's pretty intense. The second gift would be a little stranger, that they would bring frankincense, which is a kind of, and today we'd probably call it a potpourri. It's something you could light, and it's smoky, and it smells a certain way, kind of like a heavy perfume smell. It's expensive, but it's something that was normally used, especially by the Jews, in the temple for worship. So they would have associated that smell with worship, with church. It's strange. The third gift is even odder, in that they bring a gift of myrrh. Well, myrrh was a heavy perfume, and it was a heavy oil. It wasn't solid, but it was thick oil. It smelled good, but it was very powerful. It's sort of like if you opened a jar of myrrh in a room, it'd be like a junior high boy walking in after he's put on cologne. You know how it's just like, whoa, your eyes water and everything tastes funny? It's this powerful smell. It's expensive. It's very valuable. All three of these gifts are, but myrrh would have been a really different association. One of the strongest memory triggers is the sense of smell. And so when you smell something, you associate it with a certain event or experience. So when they see this, the thing about myrrh is it was used primarily by the Jews to anoint a body before burial. Because when someone would die, they didn't have refrigeration, they didn't do embalmment, and they would try to have a funeral pretty quickly, either later that day or the next day. But even then, things aren't going to smell good. And so often what the Jews would do is they'd wrap the body, they'd wash the body, wrap it in cloth, and then they would pour this oil over the cloth. It'd soak in the cloth, not exactly like a mummy, but it would be stiff, not like a crust, but it'd be kind of stiff, and it would mask the smell of the decaying body. Which means when you smell myrrh, you would associate it with a funeral, with death. To this day, if I get a whiff of formaldehyde, the first thing I think of is a frog in high school like this when we were doing dissection. Well, myrrh would be like that, pleasant, but an instant association with a funeral. So what a strange thing to bring to a baby shower. True, they're very expensive in small packages, and it could provide for Joseph and his family the ability to live for some time just on this, especially if you have to suddenly go to a foreign country. But there also seems to be another layer here where God is suggesting and foreshadowing, because Jesus is the King of the Jews, and the typical gift of tribute given to a king was gold, and generally a lot of it. The more gold you gave, the more you respected their authority and their power and so on. So gold is an appropriate gift for a king. Frankincense was used in the Old Testament. As they burned it, it represented the prayers of God's people. And in one place in the temple, the frankincense, the smoke could move through the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place, which seems to symbolize or illustrate how even though sinful people couldn't be in God's presence, their prayers were coming into His presence, and there's still this connection, and that's exactly what Jesus will do. In fact, in the end of Matthew will say that when Jesus dies on the cross, that veil is split. That barrier between God and man is what Jesus overcomes or brings together. Then, of course, myrrh. Jesus is the only child who was born with a specific purpose of dying. because that's how he would accomplish this bridging. It would be his death on the cross that would bring all this together. And so these three gifts in many ways powerfully suggest and foreshadow who Jesus is and what he's going to do and how he's going to do it. But as we read through this, and so the wise men go back to their own country because they're warned in a dream in verse 13 not to go back to Herod, because Herod doesn't want to do anything other than destroy Jesus. And so Joseph shows us this simple example of faith, of trusting God. So now he's got to go off into a foreign country and doesn't know how long, he doesn't know exactly where, and all of that. But in verse 16, when Herod realizes he's been tricked, he becomes very angry. We talked about how unstable he was and paranoid and all of that. So he becomes so angry that he's been tricked by these magi or these wise men that he has all of the male children in Bethlehem killed from 2 years old and under. Which the devastation, I can't imagine that many mothers wailing like that. But one of the interesting things that we get out of that verse is, I wonder why Herod chose to have all the boys 2 years old and under to be killed. I mean, I can understand, a margin of error, but why didn't he pick like 6 months old and under, or 9 months, or a year? Why 2 years? Well, when we finish reading verse 16, it says, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. Well, the time of what? If I read back up, was there any time that Herod discovered? And I get back to verse 7, and Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. So his timetable for the destruction of these boys comes from when the star appeared. So now as I'm starting to read this and think about this, I begin to ask, hey, wait a minute, where's the manger scene and the shepherds and the sheep? And you know how there's always that one beatific cow in the background that has this sort of holy look on its face? Where is that? In fact, in verse 11, Matthew says that when the wise men came, it says, after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they presented him the gifts. So the wise men come to a house, not a manger. If you want to scan through chapter 2, and go ahead and look into 3 and 4, and there's no mention of shepherds and sheep and manger and so on. And in fact, we might even ask, as we begin to consider, wait a minute, this is the famous nativity scene, is how many wise men were there? And if I begin to look and I realize, well, it never actually says. I know they're plural because there are plural words used. They're wise men, not wise man. They're never called kings. They're magi or wise men. We assume there may be 3 because there's 3 gifts mentioned, and it could be. But it doesn't say there's 3 because you could have had 2 bags of gold instead of 1, for example. But what about this whole manger scene? Well, if you have a ribbon, you might put it in your Bible or just put your hand there and flip over to Luke chapter 2. Because Luke also, it's a couple of books to the right of Matthew, Luke talks about the events surrounding Jesus' birth. And when we get to chapter 2, he tells us the background of the census that Caesar's taken and what sort of launches into motion all the circumstances. But when we get down to verse 6, they come along to the city of Bethlehem. Verse 6 says, while they were there, the days were completed for her to give birth. She gave birth to her firstborn son, and she wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Okay, so this is the story that I'd heard about. And we continue to read. If you want to scan down in verse 18 all the way through verse 20, then the angels appear to the shepherds. They're out in the field. They come and they see the baby there wrapped in cloths and in a manger, again in verse 16. And then in verse 20, they go back. They go back to the fields. So, all right, so in Luke 2, the shepherds come, all right, and Jesus is in a manger. But Matthew said in chapter 2, verse 11, that Jesus is in a house. Okay, so the word house and manger they're not the same. They're not similar. And then Luke tells us about the sheep and the shepherds and all that, but he never mentions any wise men, any kings, none of that. And Matthew doesn't mention the manger scene. So why are these stories so different? Well, there's some signals here if I start looking. One is I go back to Matthew 2, and I find out that Herod had all the boys 2 years old and under killed, according to the time that he learned when the star appeared. It turns out there's a word I sort of read over as the chapter began. In Matthew 2, verse 1, the text says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem," which means what happens in chapter 2 is not the events of Jesus' birth, but things that happened after. Now, to be fair, I don't know if after means 5 minutes, 5 days, 5 years, but I do know it's afterwards, where Luke describes in chapter 2, verse 6 and 7, she goes into labor in those 2 verses and has a baby right there because they can't get a room in the inn or the hotel. So Luke 2 is the event of birth. Now, another thing I could notice is that Luke describes Jesus as a baby all through the text, where Matthew describes Jesus as a child. And you can use them the same, but we normally describe a baby. We typically think of an infant or immobile, pretty young. Child, it can be a general word that includes baby, but when we use that word, we're normally thinking a little older, a toddler or more. Well, it turns out that Matthew and Luke are describing 2 different events. Luke gives us the events when, sure enough, Mary goes into labor and Jesus is born. And of course, when Jesus is born, that's when the star appears. Well, now you got these wise men in the east somewhere. The star appears, but you got to give them time to get there. I don't know where they're from, but there's some hints that they may be from Babylon. It doesn't say that, so that's just an assumption. But they're called MAGI, which is a Babylonian word. They're from the east, which Babylon would be from the east. They have a knowledge of Scripture and an interest in the King of the Jews. Why would somebody not from Jerusalem care about the King of the Jews? Well, in the previous chapter, he reminded us of when the Jews were held in captivity in Babylon for 70 years. When they came out of captivity, came back to Jerusalem, most of the Jews stayed in Babylon. Only a small group came out of Babylon back to Israel, which means in the first century, when Jesus is born, there was a large population of Jews that lived in Babylon. So, doesn't say they're from Babylon, but it certainly is hinted that way. And the last piece is, if you're going to walk from Babylon to Jerusalem, and you're going to travel at night, and you're going to travel by foot or by camel, and you can't go straight across the desert because you don't have the water, you got to go over what's called the Fertile Crescent, that it would take you about 18 months to make the trip. So Jesus is born in Luke, and he's in the manger. But Joseph's a good husband. They're not going to live in a manger or live in a stable, so he gets a job. They find a house, so that by the time the wise men get there, we're talking sometime later. They're in a house now, and if we look at verse in Matthew 2, we put verse 7 together with verse 16, then Jesus is probably somewhere around 18 months to 2 years old, which certainly fits all the different pieces that we've discussed. So isn't it interesting that I think every Hallmark card or you go buy a nativity set, you got your little manger and you got your 3 kings and there's your shepherds and all that. And as we get to looking, we start going, it's interesting because we don't know if they're 3. They're never called kings. And the shepherds and the wise men were never together around Jesus. It's just sort of an example that sometimes we can hear things or something can be, everybody knows this, and yet it not really be what the Bible says. A couple of years ago, I saw a nativity set that's made by Fisher-Price, and they always have the cute, pudgy little animals. And I was quite shocked to see that in the nativity set is a cute little pink pig. And I mean, what's cuter than a little pudgy pink pig, except that the Jews would have never had a pig. Just another example where there's a difference in hearing about the Bible and actually looking to see what it says. So as the chapter comes to a conclusion, Joseph is a powerful example of simple faith. He leaves his own country, goes off into a foreign country. He doesn't speak Egyptian. He's never been there before and has to be there for an undetermined amount of time. And then God calls him back when the time is right, and he just keeps taking the next step. For example, in verse 19, After Herod dies, the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, take the child and his mother and go in the land of Israel. That's like saying go to the U.S. That's a whole country. What do you mean Israel? Which town? What address? But as he gets closer to the nation, verse 22, when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. So after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee, eventually ending up in Nazareth. Wouldn't it have been nice if God had said, I want you to go to Egypt, you're going to be there for a couple years, and then you're going to come back and go to Nazareth, and it's all okay. But God, more often than not, doesn't spell out all the details. He simply says, trust me. And he gives us each step when it's time to take it. May we learn to follow Jesus and learn from his example that we can trust God.